On August 3, 1966, Lenny Bruce was found dead in the bathroom of his home in Hollywood. He was 40 years old. The cause was acute morphine poisoning. He had been bankrupt for years, banned from performing in most major American cities, and in the final months of his life had been unable to work in a way that sustained him. The legal campaigns against him, the obscenity arrests in San Francisco and Chicago and New York, the trials, the convictions, the appeals, had consumed his attention and his money, and by most accounts, a significant portion of his will to continue. George Carlin was at the funeral. He was 29 years old. He was still wearing suits. He was still doing safe television comedy. He was still the version of himself that would not become George Carlin for another 6 years. What he took away from that afternoon, and what it cost him, and what it eventually made possible, that is the story. Lenny Bruce had preceded Carlin by about a decade in the specific project of figuring out what comedy was actually for. Not entertainment, not the management of an audience's comfort. Something harder than that. The project of saying, in public, what most people only allowed themselves to think in private. About race, about religion, about sex. About the gap between American ideals and American practice, about the institutional hypocrisies that everyone could see and that the polite discourse of 1,950 seconds and early 1,960 seconds America had carefully agreed not to name. Bruce was the first major American comedian to understand that the prohibition on certain topics was itself a topic worth examining, that the culture's insistence on keeping certain things out of public discourse was not a neutral preference, but a political act, designed to protect certain interests by limiting what could be said about them. He understood this, and he said it out loud. And the response of the institutions that controlled public speech was to prosecute him for saying it. The prosecutions began in 9061 in San Francisco. The charge was obscenity. The specific material that generated the charge was a set that contained, among other things, jokes about religion and race and the bodily functions that polite society preferred to manage with euphemism. Subsequent arrests in Chicago and New York followed similar patterns. Bruce was convicted in New York in 964. The conviction was eventually overturned posthumously in 2003 and spent the years before his death appealing the verdict, an obsession that consumed him professionally and personally until there was very little left. The people who knew him in the final years describe a man who had been ground down by the machinery of institutional opposition, not broken in spirit exactly, but depleted, the specific exhaustion of someone who has been fighting the same battle for too long against opponents with more resources and more staying power. The humor did not entirely leave him. The precision of his thinking remained. But the energy required to put that thinking in front of an audience night after night in the face of ongoing legal threat and professional exclusion had been worn through. He died on a Tuesday in August. The funeral was small. The entertainment industry that had applauded him during his early career, before the prosecutions had made association with him professionally risky, was largely absent. The people who came were the people who had been willing to keep coming throughout the difficult years. George Carlin was among them. He was not, in 1966, a peer of Bruce's. He was a younger comedian with a respectable career, a growing television profile, and an act that was, by the standards of the day, careful. He had admired Bruce from a distance, had seen in his work a precision and a courage that was unlike anything else available in American comedy, had recognized in the project of saying true things about false institutions something that aligned with his own instincts, even when his own instincts were not yet finding full expression in his work. He had watched the prosecutions from that distance. He had watched the career erosion and the legal obsession and the final years of diminishment with the attentiveness of someone who was learning something, even if he was not yet ready to name what he was learning. At the funeral, he was one of the few people in the room. He stood with the others who had come, the small number willing to be counted in public as people who had valued what Bruce had done. He did not speak publicly about what he thought or felt in that room. He did not need to. The decision he was working toward was not made that afternoon. It had been accumulating for years. The funeral was the moment when the accumulation became undeniable. 6 years later, in 1972, George Carlin appeared at the Santa Monica Civic Auditorium with long hair and a beard, and material about language and authority, and the 7 words that could not be said on television. He had thrown away the suit. He had walked away from the Las Vegas contracts. He was performing for the first time as the version of himself that the early career had been building toward, and the Bruce years had been pointing toward. He never said explicitly that the funeral had been the turning point. He was not a person who organized his biography around single, decisive moments. He understood, with the intelligence that shaped his comedy, that things rarely turn on single moments, and that the narrative of the decisive instant is usually a simplification of something more gradual and more complicated. But he talked about Bruce throughout his career. He referenced him in interviews, in the few occasions when he discussed his influences directly, with a specific quality of acknowledgement that goes beyond professional admiration. There was something personal in it, the recognition of a man who had understood something important and had paid a serious price for understanding it, and whose payment had clarified something for the people watching. What Bruce had demonstrated, at the cost of his career and ultimately his life, was that the machinery of institutional opposition was real. It was not metaphorical. It was not the performer's paranoia or the comedian's self-aggrandizement. The people who wanted certain things left unsaid had the means to make the consequences of saying them severe. That was true. It was demonstrably, concretely, documented in court records true. What Carlin took from that truth was not fear. He had decided, by the time his own transformation began, that the fear was the wrong response, that the correct response was to be more careful than Bruce had been. Not more careful about what you said, but more careful about how you said it, about the craft that delivered the observation in a way that could not be easily dismissed, about the precision that made the argument harder to attack without engaging with what the argument actually was. Bruce had been prosecuted largely for his language, for the specific words he used. Carlin understood that the language was not the vulnerability. The vulnerability was giving the opposition a surface that did not require them to address the substance. He decided to build a surface they could not easily attack without attacking the substance directly. He spent the rest of his career doing exactly that. In August 1966, Lenny Bruce died alone in a Hollywood bathroom, 40 years old, bankrupt, and banned from most of the stages in the country. George Carlin stood in the room at the funeral and understood something that would take 6 more years to fully become his work. He kept the part about saying what you think. He added the part about making them listen. The result is what we have. Some of it began in that room on a Tuesday in August, with a small group of people willing to be counted.